Hello and welcome to History Blunders That Changed the World. Today we're going to be looking at the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. This was a failed CIA-sponsored attack to remove Cuban leader Fidel Castro from power. It turned out to be a disastrous mission that embarrassed the U.S. and set the stage for animosity between the two countries that is still in place today, almost 60 years later. Since Cuba goes on to become a very important player in Cold War politics, the Bay of Pigs invasion was essentially a mistake that changed the world. Prior to the Cuban Revolution, the leader in Cuba was Fulgencio Batista. He had been a corrupt and repressive dictator and was essentially a U.S. puppet. He was pro-American and had very close ties to U.S. companies. At that time, American corporations and wealthy individuals owned almost half of Cuba's sugar plantations, sugar mills, and the majority of its cattle ranches, mines, and utilities. Batista did very little to restrict their operations. The corruption in government in Cuba also meant ties to the American mafia and sin tourism. If you've ever seen the movie The Godfather, I believe it was part 2, you will remember a scene in the movie where Michael Corleone is wary of investing in Cuba when he witnessed some of the rebel protests and acts of sabotage right before the Cuban Revolution. As you can imagine then, the conditions of the lower classes in Cuba were quite bad. For most measures, rural Cubans lived in poverty, exploitation, and were the poorest of the poor in Latin America. The corruption and brutality of the Batista regime meant that many people welcomed Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. It's important to note that at the time, Castro didn't really have strong ties to communism. In fact, the revolution's message was one of independence and self-determination, therefore more nationalist than socialist. Initially, it attracted very little attention from the Soviet Union. In the beginning, Castro tried to establish good relations with the U.S. He visited New York. He tried to get a meeting with Eisenhower, who refused to meet with him, but did send his vice president at the time, Nixon. And Nixon's conclusion was that Castro was a communist. So there was now escalating conflict between the two countries, especially as Castro put together new land reform policies and made attempts to equalize the wealth.
The first priority of Fidel's revolution was the redistribution of land through the Agrarian Reform Act. Under Batista, foreigners had owned more than 70% of the arable land. Most of the sugar industry was in U.S. hands. At first, quite modest land expropriations were proposed. They even included land owned by Fidel's family.
Fidel quería que fuera la primera. Mi padre decía, tengo un hijo estudiando para abogado para que le defienda los intereses. Y bueno, mire, el abogado fue el que firmó la ley de reforma agraria.
Besides land redistribution, the reform included healthcare, education, housing, and road building in rural zones.
Ya que nuestra reforma agraria afectó intereses de grandes compañías norteamericanas. A nosotros nos hacían la guerra por hacer la reforma agraria y en cambio después Kennedy estaba promoviendo la reforma agraria en América Latina para evitar revoluciones radicales.
Yeah, about a year after the agrarian reform was introduced, and some American properties, rural properties, the King Ranch and so forth, were nationalized, the Cuban government ordered the foreign refineries, two of which were American, to refine Soviet crude oil. I think their first inclination was to do it, but they were encouraged by the U.S. Treasury Department not to. So they refused. They would not refine the Soviet crude. The Cuban government then nationalized those refineries, the oil companies in Cuba. The United States retaliated for that by cutting off the Cuban sugar quota, and Cuba then retaliated for that by nationalizing all U.S. properties in Cuba. And in October of 1960, the United States imposed the embargo against Cuba. So it was sort of one step led to another.
Cuando Fidel lee el decreto más importante de la Revolución Cubana,
en su afán de controlarlo todo,
la emoción de Fidel es tanta que Fidel enmudece, pierde la voz. Y aquello fue una expectación tremenda porque era ante las cámaras nacionales e internacionales y Fidel mudo delante del micrófono. Y entonces Raúl, inesperadamente, toma el micrófono y continúa leyendo el decreto de expropiación de las grandes compañías norteamericanas en Cuba.
porque se ha ido una voz por un momento, pero ahí está él y estará. Compañía Cubana de Electricidad. United Fruit Company.
In January 1961, upon coming to office, John F. Kennedy inherited an Eisenhower administration plan to invade Cuba using CIA-trained Cuban exiles. JFK changed the plan a little bit in that he was adamant that American troops not be directly involved in the operation. After all, he didn't want to potentially start a World War III. The operation took place in April 1961, and it was a complete fiasco for the U.S. Instead of being welcomed by locals as liberators, when the exiles landed in Cuba, they were attacked and outnumbered by Castro's troops and tanks.
Fidel dirigió personalmente las operaciones y rechazaba la petición de nosotros que se pusiera a un mayor resguardo, a una mayor distancia del frente de combate.
The Bay of Pigs invasion, which was launched from Nicaragua, ended in disaster. The forces directed by the United States met with intense, unexpected Cuban resistance, and the battle ended in 72 hours. The captured Cuban exiles were later exchanged for baby food and medicine. In the mountainous regions, opposition groups financed by the CIA formed pockets of resistance against the revolution, but they were eventually overcome. The overt war against the country became a covert war against the man.
It was a long-running policy of the United States government, not just of the CIA, because they carry out the orders. They don't determine who's going to get assassinated. But they carry out the orders, and they had the orders from the higher-ups in the National Security Council and the Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson administrations.
The exiles had some air support, but JFK was determined to keep the U.S. involvement a secret, and as the initiative turned against the invading force, he even backed away from providing more critically needed air cover. Now, who else would JFK imagine the world would blame for the invasion of Cuba is unclear. The exiles surrendered after less than a day of fighting. 114 were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. There were many lengthy negotiations about the Cuban exiles, and in the end they were sent back to Miami in exchange for about $50 million worth of food and medicine. Castro managed a win with the Bay of Pigs, but he was now very convinced that the Americans will invade the island outright. After all, there has been a history of U.S. interference in Latin American politics. For example, the democratically elected leader of Guatemala was ousted in 1954 by a CIA-backed coup d'etat. Therefore, after the Bay of Pigs, Castro cemented his relationship with the Soviet Union. Castro publicly declared his allegiance to communism and to the Soviet bloc. Therefore, the Bay of Pigs invasion was supposed to rid the hemisphere of a potential Soviet base, but instead it pushed Fidel Castro into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. It was meant to undermine his revolution, but it truly helped him to consolidate it. There were other pretty significant consequences as a result of the Bay of Pigs. So a year later, in 1962, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was 13 days of terror as the world faced a possible nuclear holocaust. It also led to the longest, most aggressive embargo in history, one that exists to a certain extent still today. The Bay of Pigs also led to Cuba becoming much more influential in the world of Cold War conflicts afterwards. And we see the involvement of Cuba not only in Latin America, but to Angola and other African states, and even in Vietnam. With the fear and suspicion of communism, the U.S. has dragged on this conflict with Cuba for such a long time, and I think one of the ways it has really backfired is that it has allowed the leaders to justify authoritarianism. After all, the leaders could rightly argue that their independence is still in danger and that in many ways they still need to have a strong hold in order to protect their revolution. If you enjoyed this video today, please give us a like, and if you're interested in learning more about historical blunders that have changed the world, please subscribe. Thank you very much for watching.